Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Rhode Island House of Representatives Committee on Health, Education, and Welfare. Today is Wednesday, January 20, 2016. Could the clerk please take the roll? Here.
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 Andy, Representative Lancia.
Here.
Representative Malinaro.
Here.
Representative McLaughlin. Representative Warren.
Here.
Representative Price. Here. And Mr. Regenberg. Here. We have a quorum.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are going to consider three pieces of legislation, three bills. That means we have held hearings on these bills. We have worked on them. All of the members are very familiar with this legislation. All three of the bills were voted on in this committee last year and also debated on the House floor. So at this time, I would like the members to take a look at House Bill 7054. And also, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to also entertain a motion for the rest of the bills that are on the calendar to hold those bills for further study. So we'll first of all do the bills that we are considering. Could the members please look at 7054 by Representative Lombardi? This bill requires school districts to conduct screening for dyslexia and other reading disabilities for school children who have exhibited one or more potential indicators using certain screening methods selected by the Commissioner of Education. And the most important aspect of this bill is the definition of dyslexia, which Senator Lombardi worked on with a large consortium of individuals. Is there any discussion on this bill? There is no discussion or questions. At this time, I will entertain a motion.
I so move.
Representative Diaz moves passage, second by Representative Amore. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Thank you. That bill prevails. The next bill we are going to consider is House Bill 7052 by Representative O'Brien, an act relating to education. Adds dyslexia-targeted assistance as a required aspect of the literacy program for the students at the elementary grade. Again, we worked on this last year extensively. It was reviewed by Representative Norton's Dyslexia Commission. And is there any discussion? No discussion or questions. At this time, I will entertain a motion.
To approve.
Representative Azzanaro moves passage, seconded by Representative Corvese. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Thank you. The next bill we are going to consider is House Bill 7051, an act relating to education, mayoral academies. This provides the creation of a new charter public school or the expansion of an existing charter public school would require approval from the city or town council, each sending to that district. All of us heard last week the explanation by the sponsor, Representative Serpa, who told us of the story of an outside mayor imposing a charter school, mayoral academy in her city that almost threw the city into bankruptcy. But further than that, we also have the Rise Mayoral Academy in the northern section of the state, where all of the sending towns passed resolutions against participating in the program. That went before the Department of Education. The Department of Education, with those resolutions and that knowledge, voted to grant the charter. So that is the issue with this bill, having elected officials have a say in how money is spent. At discussion. This, I realize, is a bill that people might have different issues on, so I will ask for a roll call vote. And without objection, if Representative Handy could be voted on the affirmative, Representative Handy, on the other two bills. Okay, at this time I will entertain a motion. Representative Corvese moves passage, second by Representative Amore. Roll call vote, please. Yay, yes.
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 Representative Abney. Representative Ackerman. Representative Moore.
Yes.
Representative Maldonado. Yes. Representative McLaughlin. Representative Morin.
Yes.
Representative Price. Representative Greenberg.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. That prevails. Representative McLaughlin is here without objection. Representative McLaughlin, would you like to be recorded in the affirmative for three? Representative McLaughlin is reflected in the affirmative for those three votes. Next, I am going to make a motion to hold the following bills for further study: House Bill 7050, House Bill 7056, 7057, 7058, and 7059. Going to make a motion to hold those for further study. Second by Representative Azzanaro. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Thank you. You want to do yours first? And the first bill that we're going to hear is by Deputy Chair, Representative Diaz. And Representative Diaz, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the HEW. As you recall, a couple of years ago, we passed legislation to try to address the student suspension. Due to the suspension in the school, many kids and many young students drop school. So after we passed the legislation that I had the pleasure to work with Chairman McNamara, we did a significant change in the suspension of students in our state. So eventually, we have to coming back to the suspension, address new issues, and that is what House Bill 7056 is trying to address. I'm so pleased that I'm following the path of my colleague John Lombardi. If you notice, we have a similar bill today. We have a slightly different at the end of the bill. And I will let my colleague Lombardi to have the pleasure to explain the bills which address the same one. But mine is only different. The last line, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, the last line of the bill which saying that the students represent a demonstrable threat to students, teachers, or administrator. So what it means is, if the school and administrator collecting data about suspension, and that the purpose of the data has to be addressing the reason why the students were be suspended. So we now further comments. Before I finish, Mr. Chairman, I want to welcome Hillary from ACIU. Hillary multiply. You can see she have a baby in the room. I'm so excited and happy to welcome her and the baby, and happy to see you working again with us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Diaz. And to expedite this, Representative Diaz, seeing that there are many of the people, bless you, many of the people signed up on both of these pieces of legislation, I'm going to call on Representative Lombardi. At this time, Representative Lombardi, we're going to hear both of these bills at the same time, and people can voice their support, because rather than calling them all up twice. Welcome, Representative Lombardi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. And I've worked with all of you, especially you, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Amori, and I know how much you care about the health, welfare, safety, and education of the children in the state of Rhode Island. My bill, this act would direct all school superintendents to review discipline data for their school district to determine whether there is an unequal impact on students based on race, ethnicity, or disability status, or to respond to any disparity. Every school district may submit a report to the Council on Elementary and Secondary Education describing any action taken on the disparity. All such reports will be deemed public records. This act would also provide that student suspensions would not be served out of school unless the student's conduct meets certain standards. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, you know, especially in the poorer neighborhoods, the poorer districts that many of us represent. You know, Providence is a majority-minority city with nearly 85% of the children are of minority status. And, you know, oftentimes they say that, you know, this type of conduct may not be best beneficial for those children, especially those that have, you know, other issues going on. I think this is a good gatekeeper to review those records. I commend my colleague who just disappeared, Grace Diaz, for her hard work.
She has another meeting. That's it.
No, I know. I just think this is good legislation. I think it makes sense, and it really holds the feet to the fire of people in the position that need to keep their feet to the fire to make sure that our children are being treated fairly, honestly, above the board, and co-equally. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will endeavor to answer some questions if I can. If not, I know you guys are very familiar with this. So.
Yeah, Representative Lombardi, we're very familiar with this. We passed this, I believe, unanimously last year. And for the edification of all of the witnesses, everyone is pro on this bill. There is no opposition. So let's try not to repeat ourselves, and if you could try to limit your testimony to 2 minutes, that would be greatly appreciated. I would recommend that you do not read your testimony. If you have written testimony, please submit it to us. We'll copy it and hand it out to the committee. So with that being said, and everyone in favor, unless someone tells us something really bad about it, I don't think so, but I think it looks pretty good. Mr. Andy Andrade from Education, Sabrina Soshi, I know I had that last week. Soki, what is it? Scoshi, I'm sorry, Ms. Scoshi, and Barbara Scott. Please come forward. Skokie, the Honorable. Joanna. Joanna.
Sabrina, though. I like
Sabrina, yeah, it's close. And
please let them.
Ladies first. Ms. Scott, please proceed.
I will be fast. It's a privilege being in front of you now, and I commend you all for looking at this so seriously. I represent the Rhode Island State Council of Churches. We, of course, deal with most of the denominations in Providence and the state, and we are going to try hard with our membership, to work along with families to solve some of these difficulties. But what you're doing on the state level, it's very important to us. The suspension is not used as an educational tool because it doesn't work. And it sounds like you already know that. And so it's a privilege to be in front of you, and I just wanted to add the Council of Churches' voice in support of what you're doing.
Thank you. Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Barbara, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Rhode Island Advocacy for Children supports both of these bills, and we recognize that we need to collect data. There is nothing that anybody can do without collecting data. And so these children who receive suspensions or are sent home, because sometimes that happens, rather than actually giving a suspension out, the school calls the parent and says, come pick up your kid. We need that data as well, so that we make sure, especially children with disabilities. And they might not be recognized in the schools, but there are children with unseen disabilities that are so often suspended. So I support
Thank you. Mr. Andre?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, first of all, I want to commend Rep. Diaz and Rep. Lombardi for their advocacy. And also, I know, Chairman, you've been involved in this very much, and also Rep. Amori. We support the bill, as we always have. And I just wanted to let you know that there is a lot of data available for superintendents to look at to make these determinations. And so, I mean, we have tons right down to the nature of the infraction, the consequence, the length of the suspension, the date of the infraction, whether a weapon was involved, whether anyone was injured, and a ton of school-specific data, district-specific data. So there's a lot of information that will be helpful as a tool to the superintendents when they look at this and hopefully refine their plans if there's something amiss in any way. So we certainly support this legislation.
Thank you. Are there any questions for these witnesses? Thank you very much. Yes, Representative Amore.
Just quickly, thank you, Chairman. Andy, do you have any idea how many districts have in place an in-school in-house suspension?
Not off the top of my head, Greg. I will get that to you. We definitely have it, but I didn't look at that specifically, but I will get it to you.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
I know, Representative Amore, we used to have an after-school suspension program for students, and the students hated that. They really, when you suspend many students say, well, we're going to suspend you for 2 days. So it's like they're going on vacation, especially if the parent or if they're lucky, parents on home. But the alternatives are very important in terms of school management policy.
Chairman, one of the things that I did when I was looking at this that I thought was interesting, remember we at one point outlawed attendance as the only factor in a suspension, and that was that legislation, that was the most the biggest reason for a suspension. Now it's let's see what my notice is. At one point it's insubordination and things like that. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
We were able to.
And when we eliminated truancy as a cause of suspension, talk about insanity,
right.
It decreased the suspension rate by 30%, thanks to Representative Diaz's great work.
Correct.
Are there any further questions for these witnesses? Thank
you, sir.
A specific question from Representative, yes, go ahead, McLaughlin.
Chairman, I'm glad you remember the suspensions. I was privy to be.
Part of that, and we thank you for your support, Representative McLaughlin. Thank you very much. The next three witnesses, Mr. Tim Duffy, Rhode Island Association of School Committees, Mr. James Parisi, and Randall Rose, all in support. Mr. Duffy, early bird gets the worm.
We support the legislation. Suggestions?
Is your button up? Yep.
Yes, it is. Just some suggestions. And I think part of this, the discussion that just ensued, kind of reflects this. It might be advisable to include language directing RIDE to develop at least the reporting forms and some guidelines as to what constitutes suspension. Because I think if you went out into the schools and into the districts, part of the problem is that people interpret that differently. So, I mean, I think they need to get some clear direction from the department, including the forms that, I mean, they could issue a report and people would be sitting there not making heads or tails from one district to another because the reports aren't consistent. So I would just recommend we support the legislation, but maybe some added language that directs RIDE to develop at least some reporting forms so that there's some consistency so we can compare the data appropriately.
Okay. Mr. Parisi?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I didn't put a P for pro. I support part, and there's a part I have some concern with. Maybe to Mr. Duffy. The Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals appreciates the committee's work to include language in the bill that passed on the floor last year to include the faculty in the deliberations on what revisions to discipline policy may be developed by the superintendent. I testified on that issue, and you were kind enough to listen to the teacher voice, and you included some language that appears in Representative Diaz's bill, but not the Representative Lombardi's bill on that issue. So on the issue of looking at data and coming up with a response, we are in full support. I'm still concerned about Section 2, which has some language that could really hamstring school administrators in disciplining students. And while I concur with everyone else that suspending kids for truancy it doesn't make any sense at all, there are some student conduct that goes beyond just the threats, the physical threats that may warrant an out-of-school suspension, but would be prohibited by the exact language of the bill. So I'm concerned about the overly broad suspension prohibition in Section 2. Section 1 makes good sense for me, and if some folks want to sit down and talk about what language on suspension may make sense, I think you need a little more clarity other than referring to that Section A of this existing law, because there's language in Section A that talks about what a safe school is and separately what a disruptive student is. I'm not 100% sure, what that provision is referring to, and I'm sure lawyers would spend a lot of time in due process hearings gumming up the works. But at the end of the day, teachers don't control student suspensions, but teachers deal with the consequences of behavior or lack of enforcing rules, and we don't want to hamstring school administrators from making appropriate out-of-school suspension decisions. Thank you.
Randall Rose, I know you came in late. In support? Okay, yes. Representative Regenberg.
Hey, Jim. Just wondering, what would you sort of consider as an appropriate use of suspension? In what cases is it useful for the student or the school community that wouldn't be included in A?
Well, I think there's some conduct that maybe relates to destruction of school property or setting fires that isn't addressed in the specific words, but I'd absolutely want someone like that out of a school building for a period of time.
And do you think that a suspension would solve that problem, sort of long term?
Well, if I was to write my Christmas wish list, I would put in a bill that would mandate school districts to provide alternatives to suspension, but this bill limits suspension. It doesn't require alternatives to suspension, after school suspension, Saturday school. There are other things that school districts can and should do to guide student behavior, but that's not in this bill. This bill is just restricting opportunities for suspension, and I just want people to be aware of the other end of that, which is maintaining a good learning environment for all students of all colors and creeds.
Mr. Parisi, if you come up with some language, we will meet with our attorneys and the sponsors of the bills and see if we can work something out.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Chairman.
You're welcome. Yes, question, Representative McLaughlin.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
In reference to what you had described, as language, and I would also ask the sponsors of this bill, and I'd like to make it emphatically clear, okay, Representative Lombardi, and that to take a good look at this language. I'm all for in-house suspension, but there are some suspensions that go beyond that. When I say that, for example, and I'll make it short and brief, first day of teaching, my daughter's at Durfee High School, okay, a kid picks up a chair, okay, and throws it across a classroom to hit another student. She goes to intervene, okay, and the kid took a shot at her. Okay, so I know what be aware of. What he didn't know was she's a black belt in karate. Okay, but she came home with tears in her eyes, and she said, "Dad," she said, "I could lose my job." I said, "For what? Defending yourself?" So there's a fine balance that you have to draw. Okay, so I just ask that you make that.
They will. The sponsors will sit down with them and
thank you.
See if we can work something out. Any further questions for this witness? Thank you very much, Mr. Parisi. Next, Tia Beckman, Zach Mirza, and Suzanne Arena testified is in support of this, but will not be speaking today. Hillary Davis, please. You can bring your son up as well, Hillary.
You read my writing today.
Yes.
Thank you.
Ms. Beckman, please proceed.
Okay. In schools, I wanted to mention in my district is truancy, there's social restriction, detention, in-house restriction, suspension, and expulsions. So if all of those could be tracked, that would be great, because those are the general words. And each of these consequences means removing the student from the educational community. I have difficulty with that. I would love to see language in a new bill that talks about conflict resolution, and maybe offering that as an option and being able to track to see what is successful. I have handed out handouts on restorative justice. I would like to see positive tools for teachers so that the suspensions can be reduced. In one district, there were tons of suspensions, and I spoke with people. And it was because those with dyslexia, some of them, the 50% were due to students with IEPs, and we know a lot have dyslexia. Those with dyslexia like to avoid school. They will be behavior problems. They will stay home. And with just expulsions and suspensions and in-house restrictions, we don't address any of that. Years ago, Eileen Norton brought forth a bill that all students faced with truancy court receive a neuropsych eval. And it would be interesting with your tracking to see how many of the truant students need such things. Thank you.
Very good. Mr. Mirza?
Hi, Zach Mazzara, Director of the Providence Student Union. That's fine. Thank you, Chair. I want to note this is the first time that I think I've ever spoken in favor of a bill for Providence Student Union. They're supposed to be the voice of the organization, but they held a press conference about 30 minutes ago on a different issue, and I thought, they've been working on this for so long to get this passed, and we're so close that I should come and express my support and help push it over the edge. Don't want to take too much time. I think the support of the bill and the summaries thus far have been very helpful. Two things I wanted to say. This is something that also pertains to students outside of high school. So in 2013 to 2014, there were over 1,000 students in elementary schools who were suspended. Oh, yeah. And I really want to think about activating the argument of violence or someone throwing a chair in regard to those students. Is that actually the most effective way to solve those problems whenever we're dealing with a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old? And then second, yes, we're collecting this data already, so I don't think it's a big data burden. But I do hope, in response to some of the arguments that were made earlier about providing leeway for teachers and finding alternatives, that in coming up with a plan in the districts, that they can activate some of these responses around justice and thinking about alternative suspension methods and eliminating it in different ways. So I think this actually does allow the leeway to districts and principals to figure out ways for alternative responses and doesn't hamstring too much. I still think the conversation should happen, but I think this is a really strong bill with a lot of flexibility.
Thank you, Mr. Mazzara. And also last year, your students brought up a very key point, and that is students that were coming in late ended up not going to detention and being suspended.
I think that the
very, very key point that gets people around the law with the truancy factor. And
I think that's where there was the decrease because of the work you did on truancy, but I think there was also some conversion into insubordination and disorderly conduct as students did not attend the after-school detention that they were assigned because they had to go to work. support their families.
So please let the members of your organization know that we remember the very effective testimony from last year.
Thank you.
And appreciative of your testimony and theirs. Ms. Hillary Davis, the ACLU, and your son is?
My son is Elijah.
Elijah, welcome. Please proceed.
On behalf of the ACLU of Rhode Island and the class of 2033 over there, I'm here in strong support of this legislation, particularly in support of Representative Diaz's bill, solely because it matches the Senate version that was passed last year. As you may remember, in the very last minutes of the very last day of the legislative session, this bill was one of the ones that came up. The House version, the sub-A never made it to you, and so when it was voted on the floor, it was incorrect. The two versions were never made whole, and the bill failed. And unfortunately, that leaves the students this year open to these suspensions that they really shouldn't be having. Earlier this year, we sent all members of the committee a copy of our most recent report with the data from last year, so I won't burden you with a lot of it. We do need to mention there were more than 1,000 elementary school students who were suspended last year. 75 of them were in kindergarten. How you are supposed to behave to listen to the rules when you haven't yet learned the rules is beyond me. It's probably beyond our 5-year-olds, but here they are being suspended. It's predominantly the students of color, or disproportionately the students of color and the students with disabilities who are being suspended, and that's a very serious problem. It's been a very serious problem in Rhode Island now for many, many years, and we'd like that last year to be the last year that they have to deal with it. So I'm not only here to encourage you to pass this legislation, but to pass it in the next few weeks. What we really don't want to see is yet another year where Rhode Island students are left sort of out in the wind on the last days of the legislative session. If we could get this done soon, we would ensure that everybody is taken care of. I do want to just mention a couple of things that were brought up by previous witnesses, just to clarify a couple of things for the committee very rapidly. There is already a legal definition of suspensions. It is not necessary for this bill or any other bill to do that again. A lot of this data is already collected. That's how we get it. That's how Kids Count gets it. So to go ahead and sort of redefine suspensions would be not only redundant, but probably counterproductive. And I also want to mention that 53% of the suspensions are for disorderly conduct or insubordination and disrespect. You've heard about this question of maybe there's some tiny handful of suspensions that aren't covered. I don't believe that's true. The bill, particularly Representative Diaz's bill, clarifies that any student who is a threat to the students or teachers around them, that would be your students throwing chairs, that would be your students setting fires, can be suspended immediately. And in terms of the other fighting or anything, I can guarantee you that is probably a very small handful of the students in all of Rhode Island. I believe they are all covered by this bill. But for the 1,000 elementary school students from last year, the 75 kindergartners, we hope you will pass this bill here in the next few weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davis, and your protege, young protege. 2033. Oh.
Don't make me come back here when he's been suspended from school.
Are there any questions for these witnesses? Thank you very much. And the last two witnesses, Martha Yeager and Elizabeth Burke Bryant of Rhode Island Kids Count. Ms. Yeager, please proceed.
I really have nothing to add to Hillary's testimony. It was excellent. I would like to encourage you to support Representative Diaz's bill because the language matches that of the Senate, and hopefully they can match up very quickly and we can pass this thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth Bryant, welcome. Rhode Island Kids Count.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for your attention to this very important issue tonight. I am here representing Rhode Island Kids Count to urge your support of House Bill 7056. And like many other people have said, we were very encouraged by the progress that this bill made last year, and we are hoping for swift action in this legislative session on this important issue. We want to raise up that the bill has two important provisions. As has been noted, it addresses disparities in school discipline, which we are tracking in our Kids Count fact book and which are striking. And secondly, it limits the use of out-of-school suspensions to students who represent a demonstrable threat to students, teachers, or administrators. In our Kids Count Fact Book, just for members of the committee, we do have an indicator on suspensions. It breaks it down by city and town. We appreciate the school districts across the state who've been tracking data in terms of counting the number of out-of-school suspensions and counting in-school suspensions. None of these data tasks happen without a lot of time by our people who are in our school districts across the state. So our total for the latest data that we have is for 2013-14 school year. Out-of-school suspensions made up 51% of disciplinary actions across the state. There were 15,763 out-of-school suspensions in 2013-14 and 15,010 in-school suspensions. I don't want to leave without saying what an important role you, Mr. Chairman, and this committee plays and the General Assembly in terms of making progress on this issue. As you know, with your leadership in 2012, the General Assembly passed a law prohibiting schools from using a student's absenteeism as the sole basis for an out-of-school suspension. And since then, we have seen major declines in out-of-school suspensions statewide. So just to give you a little data on that, during the 2013-14 school year, there were 3,697 disciplinary actions in Rhode Island public schools for attendance-related infractions, and all resulted in in-school suspensions. So I think that provides momentum for a real serious look at this issue. It has made major progress in terms of the bill that you already passed, Mr. Chairman, and this builds on that progress, and we urge your positive consideration of this bill before you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Elizabeth Burke Bryant? And thank you for plugging our accomplishments a few years ago. That concludes the hearing on House Bill 7056. The next bill that we're going to hear is by Representative Lombardi, 7058. Representative Lombardi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'll be short. This bill is legislation is very simple. It calls for school committees to provide transportation to any student who lives 2 miles or more away from some not afford a bus pass, which means the students are forced to walk a great distance twice every day. Even for youngsters, that's a lot of walking, especially when the weather is inclement. It creates hazards and problems. I think Representative Regenberg, myself, and others, we did this trek once when it was 3 miles, and it was inclement weather. You had the minefield of the highways, and children had to walk in the streets, especially during inclement weather when the enforcement of shoveling snow in front of homes is not enforced, and you have a couple of feet of snow in front of a house. Those children have to walk into the street. And if we want our children to succeed, they need to be at school and certainly not staying at home. And if they're going to be productive at school, they need to be a safe way to get there in the morning and leave at night. There's nothing more uncomfortable in cold weather where you get wet, inclement weather, then you have to sit in school, then you have to go back outside, and it happens all over again. It's not a good feeling. It really isn't. I certainly had to do that when I was in school, and it's just not a good feeling. We need to create environments that are good learning environments that are safe. And you have these, the way some people drive these days, especially in the inner city, it's just not, they're more concerned about...
It's not just the inner city, believe me.
I know, but you're going to see in some of those small streets in my neighborhood that, you can pretty much touch both sides of the house, and people are, texting and talking on the phone. It's just not safe. And but anyway, so I urge. Personally, I like to make this 0, but we have to start somewhere. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know again this committee is very concerned.
Yeah. Any questions for Representative Lombardi? Thank you. And the next 2 witnesses, Mr. Tim Duffy and Rhode Island School Association, and Mr. Tim Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand the representative's concern when he introduced the legislation, I believe in the last session, Providence and Pawtucket, and I think Pawtucket corrected their practice of making students walk more than 2 miles, and I believe Providence addressed it last year. So one of the things I would just suggest that while it's well-intentioned and districts can change their mind and go back on to the requirement to have them walk further distances or greater distances, that this might be more appropriate for regulatory actions by the Department of Education. They currently promulgate rules and regulations for school bus transportation, including possible waivers to bus monitors and suggestions on bus routes. Plus, the department has an initiative to eventually assume the transportation costs gradually, implementing it over the course of many years for all the districts. So while I understand the legislation and commend Representative Lombardi, I would just suggest that maybe this really should be relegated to a regulatory matter.
Mr. Ryan?
Thank you, Chairman McNamara, and thank you, members of the committee. I certainly applaud the intent of this bill. We have great disparities in services provided to our kids who live in the inner city versus kids who live in the suburbs. And I know last winter in particular, children walking to school in Pawtucket, Providence, incredibly unsafe, whereas their more advantaged counterparts sometimes in the suburbs are getting picked up door to door. So I totally agree it's a problem. It's not right. But I think the answer, my concern is, in Pawtucket, there has been an absence of busing simply because there isn't money. And to put busing requirement in without any other changes means something else has to go. Our organization, the State Superintendent's Association, would be happy to work with the sponsor, the Department of Ed, to look at the equity disparities in transportation, to look at safety. Right now, transportation is not in the market basket, which is based on the funding formula. And I think we have to address some of these inequities so that our kids are safe and we deal with this. But I think part of the problem is certainly the kids in Pawtucket and Providence in particular should have busing to school, but they should have more money to do that to school too, particularly in Pawtucket that is funded considerably below the state average. So I think we have a couple of problems here that I think need to be looked at in concert. So we'd be happy to work with the sponsor and Department of Ed and anyone to talk about the safety and also provide the resources for that for the kids who are currently in bad situations.
Thank you. Are there any questions for these witnesses? Yes, Representative McLaughlin and then Representative Handy.
Yes. I was privy to sit in on the situation in Cumberland a few years ago, and Representative Ackerman, in reference whether it be 3 miles or a mile, the safety hazards involved. And you're right about the school committee, their funding, stuff like that. But it's something needs to be addressed. We had kids in Cumberland actually walking up Diamond Hill Road, okay, with no sidewalks. I believe the limitation of a mile, 2 miles. This is ludicrous, So I support your bill, Representative Lombardi, and I think the key answer in sitting in on these negotiations between the school committee and not having enough money and the busing, okay, is to put it in the lap of the basically the bus providers. They have to sign a contract with the school committees, and you being a superintendent, and that you throw a little bit of weight. And you can advise the districts, when they sign a formal contract with the bus company, if you want the bid, then you're going to do this, and this. So that's just my observation on it.
Thank you, Representative Handy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I two things. I know RIDE's not signed up on this one because it clearly doesn't touch them directly, but I certainly I think, again, I'd encourage you guys to reach out to RIDE as well as to the sponsors in that question along the way. But I think something along the lines of some sort of safe routes to school kind of model, maybe something also that folds that into that, because what Rep. Lombardi's talking about is spot on. I walk my son to school every single day, and it's a really, really short walk, and yet we have to walk out onto the street if there's a real problem with snow in terms of blocking it on Pontiac Avenue. Going across the bridge is a dangerous spot. So I'd say, some mix of things there really could be helpful. But I did wonder, maybe it's Mr. Duffy, or maybe it's you, Mr. Ryan, but is there...
Representative Handy, RIDE will come up. You mentioned it.
All right,
they volunteered. They're coming up.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any further questions? Yes. Representative Riegenberg, then Representative Price, then Representative Azzanaro.
Well, I just want to say I very much agree with your comments that it is a funding issue in districts that the reason is that they don't have the funding. But I think, in Providence, students were told for years that there wasn't the money. And then the Providence Student Union organized around it and elevated the issue and put pressure on the administration, and they found the money. And they didn't get more money. They said, okay, this needs to be a priority. And so I think funding needs to be a part of the conversation. But at the same time, I think there's value in saying, this is a necessity. We owe this to our students, and so we're going to say you need to figure out how to do this.
Representative Price?
I agree with the bill. I think that it's imperative that the students get to school safely, and I understand that walking on the roads nowadays is pretty dangerous. I'm pretty nervous when I'm on the roads walking, and but you're talking about the funding, the disparities of the funding for transportation, and how the people out in the rural communities get picked up door to door, and the transportation is expensive, and because of we have a lot more land mass out there, so we have to. The transportation costs us a lot more, and it could be a half a mile between homes, so the door to door would fall in place there. Could you clarify what you're talking about as far as the disparities of the transportation and the funding, and how?
When the funding formula was designed, transportation was not included in the market basket for the state share. That's one of the issues I'm bringing up. Transportation obviously is a critical issue. I mean, I believe you represent the kids in the Charahoe district.
That's correct.
Huge differences. So of course there's high transportation costs. Theoretically, Providence should have lower transportation costs because the distances are shorter. Believe me, I want buses shorter than 2 miles for our kids. I just want to have a comprehensive discussion about how we're going to pay for it. How we need equity with it. So I'm not opposed to this bill at all, but I do think we need to have a way to fund it. And the fact is, the districts that are now providing inadequate transportation, and I'd say this.
And I would just add that.
Well, it's not. This isn't a group conversation, but clearly there has to be some type of conversation about funding. It's about the funding.
Absolutely.
It's about the money. We get that. Absolutely. Are there any further questions? Oh, Representative Azzanaro had a question.
Yeah, I just, is there a distance that we're talking about here, because the bill is saying 2 miles or more? What is the distance now that kids have to walk to school?
I don't think it's set. The last two districts that were requiring students to walk more than 2 miles were Pawtucket and Providence, and both of them, as far as I know, have ceased to do that. I would just point out, relative to the funding really quickly, some states allow districts to charge students for bus services. Right across the border in Attleboro, very close, 10 minutes up the road, students, parents, it's means tested, so it's if you don't have the money, you don't have to pay, but they charge parents for bus transportation.
So right now there is no distinct mileage that in Providence, being in Westerly, Representative Price from Hopkinton area, the distances from the school are greater. So I think the distance is a mile anybody with a mile, over a mile, or it could be even 3/4 of a mile. But when you get into Providence, where everything is so close, but there'd be a lot more kids, a lot more stops to make to get these kids to school. So I'm just wondering, what is the mileage now, if there is such a thing?
It varies. Really varies, sir, because when I was in Portsmouth, for example, we would determine unsafe intersections. So some of the main roads there are just not safe to cross, Route 114, Route 138. So there would be shorter distances for certain kids based on the dangers. When I was in North Providence, because we had crossing guards, we were able to maintain a longer difference. So each community is different, and the standards are different.
Okay, thanks.
Any further questions? Thank you very much for your testimony. Next, Ms. Joanna Skokie, Rhode Island Advocacy for Children. Randall Rose. Okay. And Elizabeth Burke-Bryant and Andy Andrade. Welcome. Mr. Rose, please proceed. If you try not to be redundant.
Certainly.
Good recovery. Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I am here to support Representative Lombardi's bill, and Representative Lombardi already gave a lot of the important reasons for this. I will say a little bit more about it, however. There certainly is a cost issue, but let's be aware of what the cost issue is. If you do have students required to walk more than 2 miles, then what's going to happen is a lot of those students are going to have to pay for the buses themselves. They'll have to pay for their own bus passes, which is going to be a burden on families. So it's shifting the cost onto families. That's unfair because it means some students are going to have to pay more and others don't, simply because of the accident of where they live or what school district they happen to get into. And it's not just a matter of cost, but it's a matter of time as well. If a student is spending over an hour every day walking to and from school, because it's both walking there in the morning and walking back, then that's also going to impact the student's learning, because these are high school students. They have a lot of calls on their time. They are not going to be able to learn as well. I mean, some students are going to have the good luck to be able to be in buses where they can work on their homework. Other students are just going to have to walk for over an hour a day, which is going to have a negative impact on their learning. And I can't think of what you can really do while you're walking to school in the snow. I mean, I suppose if you're a high school student, you can be texting and talking on your phone, but that's not all that safe. So it's not very fair to the students, and it's not fair to the parents who have to bear the cost of giving their children a bus pass. I know there was a suggestion that this could be done at a regulatory level, but honestly, this is exactly the kind of issue that should be addressed in a legislative manner, because it is a matter of what's fair to parents. It's a matter of what the public really wants as priorities, and this has been getting a lot of public attention in Providence, especially when it was debated. I mean, there were cities and towns that actually tried setting a limit more than 2 miles, and it just found that it was so unpopular they had to go back on it. This should not be a regulatory decision, because if it's a regulatory decision, RIDE may end up listening to the school districts and not following the public's priorities. It's pretty clear what the public's priorities are here. I don't think this is something you need to phase in gradually, because the only school districts that required more than 2 miles have gone back on it and have realized this is not a good idea. So this is not putting any burden on school districts. It's something that the school districts are already doing. It's just saying at a legislative level, we realize this is something the legislature should be stepping in to do because it reflects the public's priorities. So I'm well aware that Representative Lombardi's bill is a popular bill. I think it has been getting public support, and I think it's something that should be put firmly into law by the legislature for those reasons. Thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth Burke-Bryant, Rhode Island Kids Count.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Rhode Island Kids Count. I'm Elizabeth Burke-Bryant, representing Rhode Island Kids Count, and we are here to support House Bill 7058, which would require that school districts provide transportation services for all students who live 2 or more miles from school. We thank Representative Lombardi for his continued leadership on this issue, and we really see it as an equity issue. It is an equity issue when there are such vast differences in terms of what it takes for different children to get to school, and it contributes to chronic absence, and everything that we know contributes to education outcomes that we don't want to see. So I urge your strong support for this bill.
Thank you. Mr. Andrade?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. We definitely support the intent of the legislation to add additional bus transportation for students that don't currently have it. A couple of things. The cost. Tim Ryan was right that it is transportation is not included in the market basket, but the General Assembly has done a pretty good job and continues to add money to the categorical aspect of the funding formula in terms of transportation. And I know the goal is to, within a very short time, to have $10 million to districts for transportation. So, and that includes regional and also non-public schools. So there has been an effort to do that. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is the fact that the RIDE we're all about efficiencies and trying to help districts curb their costs. So we've been very involved with trying to work with districts to make sure that they get the best price possible for their bus routes. So there's been an efficiency angle there as well. One important point, I think, certainly we're willing to work with anyone on this issue, and we have an office of inefficiencies. One of the things that we might need to change, we talked about Pawtucket, and I was told last year and this year that Pawtucket does not provide transportation for grades 7 through 12. So if that was the case, that would be a mandate on them. So we might need to tweak it a little bit. We certainly wouldn't want to do that. But we certainly are all about efficiencies, especially in this area, and would be more willing and able to meet with anybody to see if we can help cut costs and allow more kids to be able to be transported by buses in the state of Rhode Island.
Yes, Representative Handy.
Thank you again, Chairman. Mr. Andrade, I appreciate you coming up, even though because
I thought I signed up for this. I apologize, Chairman.
Sure.
I thought for sure I did.
So my based on sort of I think most of what Mr. Ryan was saying, and maybe to a certain degree what Mr. Duffy was saying, does RIDE have any standards around this? And if not, I'd say that, for instance, the 2-mile number makes sense to me, but it winds up just being a circle. And you can imagine, for instance, in my district, Parkview Middle School is right next to Roger Williams Park, and I can easily envision a circle, a diameter, radius rather, that could wind up actually having somebody have to walk a lot more than 2 miles, just because of the way the geography works, and you can't, the road there just isn't a road that goes straight between those 2 points, and so adding to that safe routes to school stuff. We were even talking around walking to school. There definitely are going to be situations where somebody really shouldn't walk even 3/4 of a mile. I think, again, as it was discussed, I wonder whether, I don't know if it's a mix of RIDE plus DOT or RIDE plus, but it is something that probably ought to be built on top of something like this. There ought to be a minimum standard, but I'd say it ought to go further.
Well, we definitely do not have standards. Our philosophy has been at individual school committees, they adopt these policies. It's at the local level. It's a local decision. It's a local process that takes into account the unique situations of the district. I mean, the district knows better than anyone what those rules should be. So it's a local issue at this point. We would be inserting ourselves at the state level if you'd want to do that through this legislation.
Yeah, I'm really talking about more minimum guidelines or something like that.
And we would be willing to talk about that, but that's, to date, it has been a local issue.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there any questions for these witnesses? Thank you. Oh, yes, a question.
Thank you,
Representative Amari.
I have to be consistent. It's at this point in this proceeding that I always suggest that we take some of the standardized testing money and use it towards transportation.
Very good. Thank you. And that concludes the hearing on House Bill 7058. Representative Lombardi, your last bill. And Representative Lombardi, with this last hearing, the Commission on Standard Training requires mandatory training standards for police officers and trainees in identifying, responding, and handling all incidents involving a person with developmental disabilities. For those of you who weren't here last year, we heard this bill in its entirety last year, so we are very familiar with it. Therefore, Representative Lombardi, as much time as you need to explain it, and I'm going to ask Kathy Kushner from the state give her as much time as she needs. Also, everyone else will get 2 minutes. Please proceed and welcome again, Representative Lombardi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I've kind of made it a little succinct. Read some things. Important statistics. About 3 out of 100 Americans have some type of developmental disability, and according to some earlier research, the developmentally disabled are about 7 times more likely to come into contact with law enforcement than others. As early as 2001, an FBI law enforcement bulletin recommended that law enforcement officials receive training to prepare to evaluate information and physical cues or body language that may indicate the person that they have come into contact with has autism or some other developmental disability. This legislation would require the Commission on Standards and Training to provide instruction for police officers in identifying, responding to, handling, investigating, and reporting all incidents involving any person with developmental disability. These training standards would be included in all curricula for recruits and in-service trainees in all police academies operated and certified by the Commission. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, we've read ad nauseum, we're seeing it around the country where people with disabilities, whether it be drug addiction, whatever, alcoholism, whatever it may be. And you know what? It's really tiring to hear about funding. The monies are there. Providence has like a nearly an $80 million budget. You know what? Put those money aside. Do it in concert with local institutions. They're tax exempt. We'll figure it out. You're going to want to do this. We've seen too many times, and the problem, Mr. Chair, is, if the person is a person of color, person of minority, then not only does it have a developmental disability issue, now it becomes racial in nature. We need to let our police officers know, every single one of them, that this is important. There are people out there that just can't help themselves. There may be issues that they have no control over. I'm very passionate about this, Mr. Chair. As you can tell, I think you know me well enough. I know some of you know me better than others, but I've seen it happen too often over the years. When I deal with them in my capacity as an attorney, and they say, well, I got roughed up or whatever it may be. Many of these kids, they have problems. You'd be surprised with some of the problems where it'd make your hair stand up. And I know that I know those that deal with children every day know what some of those issues are, that sometimes it's unspeakable. But that's what it's all about. And I think we really need to make this a priority to address some of the other issues. It's not a panacea, but at least it's a beginning. And I think that, and I look around this committee, I know that each and every one of you men and women care, you know about it, and let's take the first step. Let's travel that path that's least traveled. Let's be trailblazers, and I think this is one way that we can do it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions for Representative Lombardi? Thank you very much, Representative Lombardi. Colonel Stephen O'Donnell of the Rhode Island State Police has submitted written testimony, as has Maria Montanaro, Department of Behavioral Health Care and DOH. Also, in support of this is the Honorable Joanna Skokie from the Rhode Island Advanced Advocacy for Children, is supportive of this legislation. Also supportive of this legislation and not speaking is Ms. Kathy Kushner of BHDDH with an amendment, which, if she has that, you could give it to the members of the committee. And I would ask Robert Marshall, the Rhode Island Disabilities Council. Mr. Marshall. Doesn't look like Mr. Marshall. Could you identify yourself, please, for the record?
Catherine Marshall.
Oh, welcome. Catherine, please proceed.
As we said last year, what is needed here is one bill that addresses training for police on interacting with people with behavioral health needs, developmental disabilities, and deaf and hard of hearing. The DD Council would be very willing to work with a sponsor to facilitate bringing all the interested parties together to develop a single bill that meets everyone's needs and bringing it back to the committee.
Great. Are there any questions for this witness? Thank you very much, Ms. Catherine Marshall. Barbara Scott is also supporting this legislation. Randall Rose, please. And also, Will, is it Bowden? Will? Bowden, excuse me. Mr. Bowden, please. Mr. Rose, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. This is the last bill I'm going to be testifying on, unfortunately. I think one of the things that that the country has been realizing a lot about how to improve community police relations is that a lot of it comes down to training. It's not about blaming the police. It's not about being against one side or against the other. But a lot of it just comes down to training. The United States does, compared to a lot of other countries, spends a lot less time on police training, a lot less time on training police on the different situations they have to deal with. And I know police officers do have a lot of valuable training as it stands. Certainly they do have to go through some, but a lot of the training has not been updated in many years, and it is important to make sure that they deal with a variety of situations in an appropriate way. And when police officers don't have any training in how to deal with people with developmental disabilities, then they may start treating them the way that's not appropriate for their particular condition, and may end up making the condition worse, making the situation worse inadvertently. There have been many cases of people with developmental disabilities who have ended up dead after the police are called when their lives could have been saved, simply because what you and I know not to do when interacting with police, they don't know, or they have trouble controlling themselves. Now, it would be nice if there was a way of training the people with developmental disabilities so that they didn't do this, but in fact, it's a lot easier to train the officers who are responsible for treating the public in a safe way, that these are people with a condition that you have to treat a little differently. So this is very much a common sense view. I think it will save many lives, and I think it will be one more step in helping make the law enforcement in Rhode Island more of a model for the nation, which is something we can definitely improve on. So I think this is a good bill to support. And I know it's inconvenient to have to go through more training, but I think it is a good idea.
Yep, thank you. And Mr. Bowden, welcome, and please proceed.
Hi. Thank you for considering this bill. I'm here to testify in support of this bill. My wife last year spoke in front of this very committee about my son and an incident on the Newport Bridge, which made the front page. So I think that for those of you who did not hear it, there were 5 different police jurisdictions that were involved in trying to get my son safe on the bridge. While I appreciate the difficulty of the problem of having somebody like my son who's having an issue on the bridge, still, I think the case highlights the need for training because my son is 25 years old, but he's really like 3 years old, and he's nonverbal. And so the police response to what happened on the bridge really sort of showed where we're lacking in terms of training, because instead of trying to de-escalate the situation, what ended up happening was they started to yell at him, and one officer even threatened to tase him. They handcuffed him in the back of a van, transported him to Newport Hospital, where he was shot with Haldol and the heaviest drugs you can imagine when really all they needed to do was to collaborate with his caregiver, who was in the van and who was in telephone contact with my son's psychologist. So the clinical people were available at the moment. And instead, it turned into a situation where he was treated as if he were a criminal and not.
Okay, yeah.
So.
Yeah, you can finish, wrap up, Mr. Bowden. That's.
So I think his case just highlights the work that's needed in terms of how we could work to support training. And I want to highlight the fact that I think it's important to not only do it in the academies, but also to make sure that officers who are out of the academies get that in-service training so that it's a continual training.
Right. Well, thank you very much. We certainly appreciate that personal testimony, and I can only imagine that it's very difficult to come forward with that story, but I think we ended this hearing on probably the most significant testimony, which was yours, and we greatly appreciate you coming in here tonight. Are there any questions for Mr. Bowden or Mr. Rose? Thank you very much for your testimony and your time. That concludes the hearing on House Bill 7059. And with this, it's the bill we've all been waiting for tonight by Representative Azzanaro. And I will turn the proceedings over to Representative Azzanaro right now. Representative Azzanaro.
Thank you, Chairman. This is a bill I introduced last year that we went through this committee with. It was voted out of committee unanimously, went to the House floor, was voted unanimously, went through the Senate, was voted unanimously, and then got caught in what I call the shuffle, where Senate went home and the House had to go home, so it never got transmitted. So here we are again, going to hear this bill again. And what it is, I'll just read the last paragraph in it. This act would provide that where a child with a disability is enrolled in a post-secondary or transitional education program as part of the services provided to the child by the school committee or local educational agency, and such child reaches age 21 during a school or program year, then the school committee or LEA would pay for such child schooling through the conclusion of the school or program's academic year. What's happening is children in this transition program, when they turn 21, are told goodbye. It comes at any time during that school year that they are there, and I don't think it's really beneficial for this to be happening in the state or in the country. These boys and girls are in this program, and they're basically with a whole bunch of other children that need this training, and to just say goodbye when you're 21 in January, February, March, April, November, whatever the month is, and the other children, because they're not 21, finish out that school year where they probably involved in sports programs that is very beneficial for them, I think is a travesty, and it needs to be corrected. If they start the school year and turn 21 during that last school year, then they should be allowed to finish that school year out. We don't throw kids out of high school or any other school before they graduate unless they have a truancy problem or any other problems to that effect. This was brought to my attention a year or 2 years ago, probably, by my grandson Ryan, who is in the audience with us tonight, and I'd like him to come up to the table and just say a few words about what it feels like to just say you have to leave, and we're in a basketball tournament, but you can't play anymore, or we're in a volleyball tournament, you can't play anymore, or whatever the case may be. So Ryan, you want to just give us what you're feeling, how you felt when you were told you had to leave school.
I was really disappointed that I had to leave school, and I missed all my friends when I left, and I like to play. I enjoy playing basketball, unified basketball with them, and I wish I still played till the end of the year and graduated at the end of the year. And same with unified volleyball. And,
Yeah. Well, welcome, Ryan. And I noticed right away that many of our witnesses don't know enough to push the button up, and you got yours right away. And Ryan, sometimes he works as a page with us, and I know he reminded me the other day, Mr. Chairman, you've got to push your button on an important vote, so I appreciate that. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you.
And good job.
Thank you.
Good. Ryan, thank you for your testimony. And I think we have some witnesses that want to speak on this. Andy Andrade from RIDE and Robert, is it Marshall? Rhode Island Developmental Disabilities Council.
Okay, yep.
He's in.
Yeah, this is Catherine Marshall.
Okay, Catherine.
RIDE supports the bill, and we think it's a good bill, and hope you'll support it as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Joanna Skokie and Suzanne Arena.
Suzanne's not here, but I would just like to say, on behalf of Rhode Island Advocacy, that absolutely true. Couldn't have said it any better. And we thank the sponsors and the co-sponsors of this bill to make it happen. We shouldn't leave these children just out in the cold. It's wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the hearing on Bill number 7050. Does anyone have any questions? The committee members? I'm sorry.
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Azzanaro, and thank you, Ryan. We should have Ryan testify on more bills. It would expedite things. Very good. At this time, I would like to, starting on my left, Representative McLaughlin of Central Falls and Cumberland, and on his right, Representative Mia Ackerman of Cumberland and Lincoln. My name is Representative Joe McNamara. On my right is the representative with the longest drive in the state, Representative Azzanaro of Westerly. Actually drives for over an hour, and is still in Rhode Island. It's amazing. On his right is Representative Amore, who is known at East Providence High School as Mr. Amore, one of our favorite teachers. On the bottom rows, starting on the left, we have my colleague from Cranston, the chairman of the Environmental Committee, Representative Art Handy. On his right, we have one of our freshman all-stars from Central Falls, Representative Shelby Maldonado, former Peace Corps veteran of Africa. God bless your mother, Shelby. I would be a nervous wreck sending my daughter to Africa. On her right is Representative Regenberg of the fashionable East Side. On his right is Representative Kathy Fogarty, former president of the South Kingston Town Council. President Fogarty, now state representative. On her right is Representative Justin Price of, I know it's like East Greenwich, Exeter, West, what is it, Hopkinton? Is that Hopkinton? So he's like the king of that section as a state representative, doing a great job. And on his right is Representative David Bennett, RN, who is a nurse and brings his clinical practice to this committee, my colleague from Warwick. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the hearing of the Committee on Health, Education, and Welfare. A motion to adjourn. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and have a nice evening.